Got that going now. So we'll give people a couple more minutes, given the issue with the link. Thank you to everybody for being patient with us. And as people join, you'll probably hear me say this a couple of times. Everyone is joining the webinar muted as participants. However, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you as the meeting host. You may also use the chat function to enter questions or comments. As we go through the primary presentation this morning, we will also pause at key points so that we have some space to allow people to do that, so that we can make sure that the discussion keeps going. And if you have any questions before we get started, please raise your hand. Also, for those of you who are calling in, to raise your hand, it is *3.
Okay. We want to get started, Jenna?
One second.
All right, you just let me know.
That they don't see the chat. We had about 50 people and we've got 25. Because of the link, we might have to wait until 5 after, Darren. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. You just let me know.
Oh, okay. So hopefully everyone now can see the chat.
That's confirmed, Jenna. I can see it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, now I see it.
We have a call-in user with their hand raised. Do you have a question?
No. Hi, this is Penny from
There you go.
Flood
Hi, Penny.
Programs. I don't know if it's me that you're referring to, but okay. So how do I put my hand down through the phone?
I don't know.
Press
Dan.
star three.
Okay.
Press star 3 again. Press star 3
Again?
again, and then
Okay.
yep, again.
There we go.
That works.
Yay, okay, cool. Yeah.
Remember that.
I'm going to mute you just in case. I think it's *6 for those on the phone also. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started, Darren?
Okay. Good morning, Aliso Creek Watershed Collaboration Group. This is Darren Haver from the University of California Cooperative Extension. It's been a while since we've been able to all get together, and so we're excited, even though this is still virtual, to keep the conversation going. Hopefully soon we'll be able to meet as a group in person to continue this process. So this morning, we're going to start with the next slide. We're going to start with some brief introductions, and we're going to have to do the introductions through chat. So if you are able to put into the chat, we'd like to have your name and your organization. You should already have your name there, but it'd be good to put that in there so we can record it. If you're on the phone, that obviously will be a little bit difficult. Maybe, Jenna, you might have just addressed this and I missed it, but maybe they send you an email later if they called in so that you have their name and title. Okay. Yeah, the Aliso Creek Collaboration Group organization team consists of Jenna Voss from the Orange County Environmental Resources, Andrew McGuire from Orange County Environmental Resources, Avery Blackwell from Geosyntec Consultants, and Aaron Porowski from Geosyntec Consultants. So they've been helping keeping these things organized and moving along. We also have Dan Tran from Orange County IT to help us, and he's already been busy this morning. As you know, even virtual after all this time, there's always technology issues that still occur. Jenna and Andrew will be monitoring any questions that you put in chat, and we'll hopefully do a good job at making sure that we notice those and we allow you to speak as we move through the presentations this morning. Next slide. So meeting objectives and role. This is just a summary of what we're going to try to cover today, and we're going to hopefully get through all of this. The first part is we're just going to go back and reorientate the group that put all this work together, the purpose and the framework of the collaboration group. Then we'll move on to summarizing the Aliso Creek survey findings and then the development of the mini regional curve. And then we're going to provide an example of conceptual design projects resulting from the mini regional curve. And then hopefully we'll have time to present a roadmap for further conceptual design development, because that's the important part of what we came up with for this group, is moving projects forward. And then introduce some potential opportunities for funding. I want to remind everybody of our normal participant roles. That is to focus on the group objectives and moving forward. Try to listen with an open mind as much as possible. And then if you have an issue with something, make sure you attack the problem and not an individual. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to just very quickly, and I'm going to probably condense this even more just so we can get back on track, because we definitely want to make sure we have time to talk about the bulk of the project or meeting today, which is the mini regional curve. So the Aliso Creek Watershed Collaboration Group formation, it was initiated in May of 2018. And that initiation was supported by the South Orange County Watershed Management Area Integrated Regional Water Management Executive Committee. So it came about because of previous planning efforts by the Army Corps of Engineers seemed to lack the local support and collaboration. And we were looking for ways that we could improve that and actually help move projects forward. So we leveraged input from a broad spectrum of stakeholders. And next slide. And in that role, we hoped that we would create this collaboration framework. We spent a number of meetings to flesh out how that would look. We'll return to those in a little bit, so just to refresh your memory on the desired outcomes that we came up with. But the idea is to create that framework. Project concepts can expand because of that framework. We come up with more collaborative agreements and coordinated projects. We are early on identifying any barriers and issues and resolving those, and then we hopefully will result in more projects being implemented overall. Next slide. So the collaborators have been quite a large group, and I think that graphic says it all, where we had engineers, NGOs, biologists, cities, water districts, transportation agents. We had all kinds of people there. So the top group is the IWRM group, which provides our leadership and administration of the Aliso framework. We provide information back to them on our progress. We've had cities, NGOs, county, water, and wastewater agencies, and that's their idea. Their purpose on that is to express local priorities and perspectives, plan and implement projects of their own, and then hopefully communicate and collaborate with the other stakeholders in the group. And then I think another important concept, and we'll address this as we move forward into our next meetings, is the natural resource and mitigation agencies. Early on with them, interact with them and provide insight on any mitigation needs, but also provide some kind of regulatory compliance perspective so that a project doesn't get too far down the line and find those things out later. Next slide. So the key input received so far when everything was surveyed was that the decision was made to continue meeting in a large group. Originally, the idea was maybe that we'd have these little smaller splinter groups that would tackle individual projects. But at this point, it's been decided to keep the large group format until we really start diving into these project-based discussions. And those need to kind of develop more organically. So we did a summary of the scientific studies and identify any data gaps. That was at the last couple meetings. And those were some really nicely attended and interesting conversations that came out of that. And we also developed a framework process that we'll review in a little bit to document exactly how this process will work. So today's meeting is to hopefully move forward on some of the project concepts from the lower reach of the watershed. So we have a project being brought forward that we'll use as a discussion point. And then I believe in the end of June, we'll be scheduling another meeting where we can actually talk about permitting options to streamline your project delivery. So those things still need to be done, and those will be tackled in the next two meetings. I'm going to turn it over now to Jenna Voss, who will give us kind of the IRWM perspective on where we're at.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining. We've got quite a few folks on today. I presented, for those of you who were able to participate in the South Orange County Watershed Management Area Executive Committee meeting earlier this month. I gave a brief presentation on this effort and talked about how the living project list and some of the other things that we have done really stem from and always will relate back to our primary IRWM plan goals. So the premise for the South OC group is the IRWM plan. That helps us meet compliance with the State Department of Water Resources requirements for an accepted region that qualifies us for funding. But above all of that, it also establishes what the stakeholders said were the primary goals for projects to be implemented within the region. And those are increase water supply reliability and efficiency, improve water quality, protect and enhance natural resources, and integrate flood management. So you'll see on the project map, when we did an initial dive into existing project lists and did a solicitation amongst the group, we came up with 27 potential projects. 5 were existing. And we also had some really great conceptual projects come forward. We looked at this in terms of what are potentially some of the reasons why some projects aren't moving forward. Is there a need for funding, project partners, assistance with going through the regulatory permitting process? But we also filtered those all through those IRWM goals to make sure that what we're working on through this group also always harkens back to our primary goals. Next slide. As I'm sure all of you remember, we're not going to dwell on this. However, we have operating desired outcomes that will drive our conversation. Again, these really are kind of subcategories of those IRWM goals. They all relate back to that in some way, shape, or form. Several of these also are very similar to the strategies and measurable objectives in our IRWM plan. They are ecosystem is functional and resilient, coastal uses are restored and preserved, balanced local water supply enhancement, supported infrastructure function, and improved public recreation and awareness. Next. So we also, as I mentioned, through that kind of dive into the projects that are already existing within the watershed, we noticed that there were kind of rose to the top several categories of project types. Again, these are all kind of subdivisions of the way we look at projects for IRWM funding and other grant programs. However, this allowed us to get a little bit more specific in terms of the types of projects that could be looked at from a regional perspective, and those that maybe need to be grouped or that could kind of initiate some of the discussion. Next. We also, as Darren mentioned, we worked to put together what we're calling the reference guide that is still available on our website at southocirwm.org. The reference guide was the result of that comprehensive presentation of data that we collected from a lot of different sources from agencies and other groups working within the watershed. The purpose was to provide kind of a living reference tool for organizations and agencies working on projects within the watershed. So we wanted to make sure that this is a useful tool to everybody. We've made it available on the website. We want to make sure that the key content, IRWM context, collaboration tools, state of the science, project definition, and permitting options, all of that is included to be a well-rounded and comprehensive document as a reference. We are also working to make that more of a living tool through our website, so stay tuned for more to come. We will talk about this. We'll kind of wrap this up at the next meeting very briefly. Next slide. All right, I think this is where I hand it off. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jenna. Okay, we're going to move on to the mini regional curve portion of this meeting this morning. So plenty of time for prompts and questions when we move through this presentation, but I'm going to initiate the presentation by turning it over to Jennifer Shook.
Thank you, Darren. Good morning. I just wanted to take a minute real quick to introduce our next speakers and provide some context for their presentation. If you don't know me, I manage our OC Public Works Mitigation Program. And like many others in this group, I'm really keen to see what the full restoration potential for Aliso Creek is. I met George Kelly with Bespoke Mitigation Partners a few years ago at a national mitigation conference. George has over 30 years of experience in the field of performance-based environmental restoration and has worked with numerous resource agencies, landowners, investors, and private and public credit buyers in the implementation and mitigation projects. George also introduced me to Dave Beidelspech with 5 Smooth Stones, who is a design engineer with over 20 years of stream restoration experience. George and Dave have both been involved in the implementation of large-scale restoration projects throughout the nation. So because of that, I thought it'd be helpful to bring them in as a third party to have them look at Aliso Creek and see what could be possible for design options. And as part of their assessment, they did look at the core plan, they looked at the locally preferred plan, as well as our desired outcomes to take that into consideration so they know what was important to the stakeholders. Their assessment is limited in scope, so as you watch the presentation, just keep that in mind, but I am hoping that it can help move this conversation forward to see what kind of opportunities exist for some projects along the lower 6 miles of Aliso Creek. So at this time, I'll turn the presentation over to George Kelly and Dave Beidelspech so they can talk about their conceptual design and some of the foundational data that they've collected and developed for their concept design. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer, and I want to thank Jenna and the Geosyntec team as well. Great to be here today, particularly after a long pandemic. Just to kind of give you a little bit more table setting before I turn it over to Dave Beidelspech, because 5 Smooth Stones did most of the technical review that you're going to see in this presentation. But as Jennifer mentioned, I've been involved with delivering performance-based solutions in the ecological and water resource realm for some 30 years. And in that context, we've done about 52,000 acres of wetland restoration, but also over 300 miles of stream. And I think one of the key elements we want to leave you with in this discussion is that the design really does follow your goals and your desired outcome, and also your funding sources. And sometimes they may be limited, sometimes they may be broader. We know you're here in the context of the IRWM, and we know that we're looking for a lot of multiple benefits. And I think, though, it's very important to understand, though, from our perspective, when you look at these design issues, if we're looking at mitigation, it may be different from flood reduction, which may be different from a fisheries approach, which may be different from a groundwater enhancement scenario or a water quality approach. So the design for now is, a more generic approach to make sure that, we have covered your outcome desires, but, I think that still is a work in progress. Before I turn it over to Dave to really get into the heart of this, I do want to highlight one point. You're going to hear something called a multiple criteria decision analysis, an MCDA. We've used it in the context of a very narrow context of looking at what are the alternatives for stream restoration. How do you look at and evaluate your options under the alternatives approach? I think this MCDA tool is also a great tool for a broader context, looking at your living project list to be able to prioritize based on weighted averages for your desired outcomes. And so I only mentioned we're using it in a very narrow context today. It could be broadened in a much broader sense. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Beidelspech at 5 Smooth Stones, and he can give you a broader introduction and move into the PowerPoint.
All right, thank you, George. So the outline of what we'll be presenting on today will be trying to give you a brief purpose as we saw it in our assessment. A little bit of introduction to the team, which you've already had, background of why we thought looking at this in a different light to what had historically been analyzed and assessed might be important. We'll share with you kind of field work, survey methodology, what a regional curve is, its application for this type of ecosystem restoration, priority levels for restoration, which are basic concepts of what could be done, not so much what would be done, but what could be done. And then, as George talked about, the MCDA or multi-criteria decision analysis tool, then we'll talk about some example natural channel designs and geomorphic designs of stream and wetland restoration, and then we'll conclude it with next steps and just questions. So as you come up, feel free to type something in the chat. I have the chat open. If I see something come up, I'll try to incorporate it into my thoughts. The purpose, as we saw it, was really to come in here as a third party, somebody that hasn't been overly involved in the process, and provide another alternative to the Army Corps of Engineers design plan, as well as the local preferred plan. Try to look at the benefits of each of those plans and see if there's a way that we could come up with something that kind of meshed with the local preferred plan more while still achieving the risk reduction goals that something like the Army Corps of Engineers plan was really desiring. So we tried to understand stakeholder groups' desires and outcomes from different documents that were recorded. I'm sure we didn't completely understand them. I'm sure there's going to be some stuff that was missed in communication, but this is really to serve as the starting point for another alternative if it's desired by the group. Next slide. So introduction of our team, as George Kelly has said before, we've just done a number of projects throughout the U.S. and we've worked together for about 15 plus years on various projects. So just bring a different way of looking at the restoration of Aliso Creek to the table than what some other people may have looked at. So everybody on the line is probably pretty familiar with Aliso Creek, but essentially it just extends from the Cleveland National Forest to the Pacific Ocean. It has a drainage area about 34.6 square miles. So when you're looking at the regional curves, you're looking at about that 35 square mile, and you'll see that on the x-axis, and that will give you an idea of how big the channel is. Has anybody else's, let's see, just move forward. And then we also were allowed the benefit of looking at the financial and habitat considerations derived from the Tetra Tech Army Corps of Engineers analysis. So we could look at the channel width, the areas of disturbance, the haul distances, and material transport, and get an idea of what would this long-term impact be, and the cost, and both the cost and ecological impacts. So those were kind of the backgrounds that we looked at, and the easy question was, can we do something that's an ecological restoration that doesn't have as much of a temporary impact and can utilize more vegetation for stability opposed to rock and armored material that would be trucked in. Next slide. So the background of the Corps of Engineers design, they had 4 different primary design techniques, and we actually used some of the same concepts for looking at different alternatives. Their first alternative was to do nothing. Their second one to stabilize the stream bed and create a new floodplain. Third one was to raise the stream bed and connect it to historic floodplain. And then the fourth one was to raise the stream bed and create a floodplain within the channel. So for priority 2 and priority 3 restoration, they had a certain defined channel from Army Corps of Engineers alternatives, and it had a base width of about 76 feet for the bottom of the channel. And then where the Q or the 2-year discharge would show up in the channel, it had about 100-foot wide channel. When George had approached me with this, our first thought was, and George's first thought was, that seemed like a very large channel for this system, being 35 square mile drainage area. The question was, did we have to make a channel that was that big, or could we get away with a slightly smaller channel that would have less of an impact? So what we looked at as the next phase of this was really to look at some really rough hydraulic geometry relationships in the area. And there's been hydraulic geometry relationships that will take a drainage area in a region and will predict how big the channel form and discharge, or how big the primary channel needs to be before you get to a floodplain based on that drainage area. And this is something that's been worked on since the late 60s. And the son of Alda Leopold, Luna Leopold, had put together a regional curve here in California back in the late 70s. And then there's been a lot of curves done in this region since then. And one of the things that we noticed through a series of investigations before we did any work is that it seemed as if this 100-foot wide channel was significantly larger than what it would need to be for a stable stream design. So that's why we originally said, hey, we're going to come out here and try to understand how big this channel needs to be, and then we can look at the size of that channel, look at what the stream design could look like, look at the areas that would be impacted, and the temporary disturbance as long as long-term disturbance from that. So when we talk about a channel form and flow, there's three terms that are used in conjunction, and we could spend a lot more time talking about this. People have classes in the university setting that discuss the merits of each one of these, but essentially we talk about a channel form and flow, and there's three ways and documentations where that's been discussed. One is a dominant discharge, an effective discharge, and a bankful discharge. For the simplification of this presentation, we will discuss the channel form and discharge as a bankful discharge. And if somebody really wants to get into a lot more detail related to this later, I'd be happy to schedule a time to discuss it with you and say why that assumption might be correct. And we also want to look at what the bank erosion in these urban channels were. So see how much material is going to be supplied to the stream from bank erosion, and that bank erosion, is that going to have a negative impact as it's eroded into the stream, or will there be a potential positive impact? Let's move to the next slide. The next slide talks kind of about the project design flow. We'll originally looked at the regional curve analysis. Then we said, okay, well, it seems like there must be a slightly smaller channel that could be designed out here. So we developed field work and a survey methodology to go out to the field and collect a series of about 30 cross sections. And from those 30 cross sections at different points in the drainage basin, we were able to establish a mini regional curve. From that mini regional curve, we were able to look at goals and objectives of stakeholders as we understood them, with the gaps of us being brought in late, and apply priority levels for restoration, which is real basic ideas of how you could restore a stream. A lot of times these priority levels have a mixture of priority levels in the actual stream restoration, opposed to just one priority level for the whole reach. A lot of times it's a mixture of different priority levels, but this allows us to apply these priority levels to say this is what restoration could look like with this size channel. And then we can start to look at the goals and objectives in more detail to each design alternative and say, okay, well, which one meets the most amount of the goals and objectives that we have for the project, which one optimizes this? And then after we know which one's optimal, we can evaluate alternatives based on cost and reach. So let's go to the next slide here, and we'll talk about the field work and survey methodology. So on the next slide, as we continue on, our field work, we really want to talk about the feasibility of reconnecting the stream bed to any kind of historical floodplain. Some of these historical floodplains are high enough up that there's now schools built on them, there's roadways on there, and we couldn't reconnect to some of the historical floodplains. But there's lower historical floodplains that have been departed from that could be reconnected to. So we want to look at the feasibility of reconnecting to different historical floodplains. And the idea of connecting to floodplain is that as there are flood flows, energy can dissipate, it can spread out, it doesn't create as much destruction to the channel when the water depth does not increase that high. So it's an idea of spreading out and dissipating energy onto the floodplain. We want to look at reducing sediment deposits in streams, ponds, wetlands, and lakes. We also wanted to understand channel dimension assist in assessment planning process. And we wanted to have a benchmark for kind of what natural channel design could look like in this area. And the concept of natural channel design is simply saying, based on the water and the sediment being supplied to the reach, we want to design a stream that will get stronger in time based on the growth of vegetation, and it will be able to transport the water and sediment being supplied to the reach without aggrading, so basically filling in, clogging in the channel, or degrading, which is eroding and causing potential infrastructure concerns, but it will be able to move the water and sediment being supplied. And then we wanted to develop a mini regional curve, which would help us evaluate restoration options and cost. The size of the channel is significant in the cost of a construction project, as well as the impact environmentally, both short-term and long-term, of a restoration project to the system. Next slide. So what our field work looked like was we used the same reaches, which was a series of 13 reaches and some sub-reaches within those 13 reaches, as defined by Tetra Tech and the Army Corps of Engineers documentation. We didn't want to confuse the subject by creating new reaches, and we felt like the detail they had was close enough to what we would have decided in the field by creating our own reaches, that we did not feel a need to create a whole lot of additional work by creating new reaches. So we wanted to keep the same reach notation as before. So with this, in each one of these reaches, we tried to find typical cross sections that we could survey. The cross section site selection was based on the reach breaks, but an aerial photography. So if we looked at aerial photography, I'd say, okay, it looks like we have decent access here. It looks like it's going to be a tangent section of the creek. We generally survey on tangent sections of the creek where we have deposition that will occur at high flow, and at low flow we see a little bit of faster water, and we see a flow reversal over these tangent sections. So these are the riffle sections of the river, and that's where we try to focus our geomorphic assessment and cross-section survey to. Not that the pools aren't important, but they're formed by higher degrees of freedom related to how tight a bend curve is, the spacing of material, convergence scour on the floodplain. So there's other reasons why a pool will form that don't make it as good as a representation for channel size and dimension. And we wanted to know where there's open access to GPS survey, so we could look at aerial photography and say, hey, it looks like there's going to be enough space in between the leaves that we can survey here with a survey grade GPS, and we're not going to have to use different equipment that would cost more money to do. And the entire survey was done on foot, or so on foot without a motorized vehicle, with the use of bikes to get from one location to another location. So we wanted to make sure that we had access, that we could get to these reaches without having to hike really far and leave gear and equipment behind. Next slide. So with the next slide, when we talked about the field work, we went out and we surveyed with survey grade GPS. You can see in the shadow, I happened to take a picture of the only picture I had was a picture of the stream where you could see the shadow of me surveying. But we went across and just surveyed a lot of data on the cross sections, and then we compared it to LiDAR data that was available for the region. What we see for LiDAR data is that it's really good data and it will do fine for modeling, but it does not allow us to see the detail of where vegetation starts, ends, the changes in vegetation, changes in sedimentation and erosion that's needed to look at channel form and flows. Next slide. So when we were out in this field, the next slide will show a example cross sections that were surveyed, and we identified what was called the bank full indicator. And this is an indicator of where the channel form and discharge is. This is essentially if you wanted to know how big the channel was before there was a floodplain, This is how big the channel is based on the drainage area and the sediment being supplied today. So the drainage area was calculated above each cross section. Then on the cross section, we had a series of bankful calls that seemed higher than bankful. This might be because it was a scour line where material has fallen into the creek or a change in upland vegetation. And we also had a series of calls that were lower than bankful, may have been a depositional bar where we had a aquatic vegetation growing on, or it could be something where we just had a change in depositional patterns, formation of a mid-channel bar that hadn't yet become an island. So we looked at a range of bankful features that were both higher and lower than what we thought the bankful call would be. And this gives us a high degree of uncertainty of the bankful call. So we also stayed away from existing structures, including bridges and culverts whenever possible. So if we saw a bridge or culvert, we knew that that bridge and culvert can change the hydraulics. And if the stream was stable, if it had depositional features, if it had scour features, that may be affected by the flow lines going through the bridge and culvert more than the stability of a free flow and riffle section. And that's what we're really looking for, these sections that are being formed by the flow and the sediment being supplied by the watershed and not by external influences. Next slide. So we're going to move on to the regional curve application in the next slide now.
Do we have any questions for that first portion? I don't see anything in the chat, just double checking.
I was gonna jump in here. Oh, go
One
ahead.
second, Aaron. So for some reason, the chat is only available for folks to send chat to the presenters.
Got it.
So I am going to copy and paste and put into the chat for everyone. Andy is also going to add all of the attendees as part of the chat, so people can see who is participating today. So just give me, bear with us 1 second while I put the questions in the chat. Let me look through here real quick. So Mike Beenan asked, does 5 Smooth Stones have experience with watersheds discharging to marine protected areas and popular family beaches like Aliso Beach and ocean subject to summer urban runoff discharges?
Yeah, we worked with sites in Wilmington, North Carolina, and there's a lot of ideas of urbanization related to beach access as well. We've also worked on other beach locations in Oregon and Washington as well, and we've worked in Oakland, California. So we have some experience. Every site is different, and just because we had some experience doesn't mean that we have a great understanding of exactly what's going to be needed for this project without stakeholder communication and understanding things that we wouldn't know by coming in from out of state.
Okay, thank you. We also have a Q&A. So the questions will come to us, and as they're answered, we can assign them, or we can, if they're answered verbally, I can include that in the Q&A. Christine Medek asks, if open access for GPS is required for collecting channel cross sections, does this bias the data towards areas with higher erosion? Less vegetation equals more subject to erosion equals more open access.
Yeah, and that's true. There'd be a slight bias towards areas that have a little bit higher potential for erosion. We would not choose any cross sections that were actively in a high degree of instability. We'll take sites that are in a quasi degree of equilibrium, but not a high degree of equilibrium, and where we just have such dense vegetation cover, we could not have surveyed in those locations. Now, our survey was done in December, so we were able to get some pretty dense canopy cover that we were able to survey underneath, just because it's a little bit more open in December than it is in other months. But it's still we still do have a slight bias towards areas that are more wide open or lower vegetation that we can put the rod above. So that's correct. There's a little bit of a bias towards that.
Okay, Steve Deshawn asks, has anyone investigated what the upper reach work is going to do to the flows in the lower reaches? In parentheses, reach 3 and 4.
Not at the point where we're investigating that at this time. All we're looking at is things related to phasing and construction. So the idea is, well, if we're going to have work being done in the upper reaches, how do we phase that so that we don't fill in what's being done in the downstream reaches, as well as what are some temporary sediment control measures that could be done to be able to limit the temporal impacts of this work. But we're not quite far enough along to look at a real detailed analysis of staging and construction, and we don't really understand where the funding would come from for all these different reaches yet, so we don't know if we'd start in reach 13 or start in reach 3 at this point.
And I'll just chime in real quickly and say that,
Yeah.
Dave, I'm going to ask you a question probably later about the role of watershed flow controls on the channel design, and so if, you know, that may also be related to the question posed, and we can come back to that when you present the design concept.
Okay, we have another question here from Charles Busslinger. Can you provide some background on the technical team's experience with Southwestern U.S. streamflow projects?
Yes, in the Southwestern U.S., we've done a fair amount of work in Arizona. We've done some work in Nevada and Reno, as well as Carson City. And then my work is out of Colorado, so we do a lot of work in New Mexico as well. So when it comes to, you know, kind of semi-arid environments, that's an area that we work in fairly often. I don't know the exact detail of what Charles wants related to a background, but we have some background related to work in streams that are similar to this. As I said before, all streams are different. I've never been on 2 projects that I said, well, just like that project. I always find out something new in each project we work on.
Okay, we have one more question from Charles. Can you provide some background on the technical, oh, sorry. Hasn't the lower reaches of the watershed already been surveyed multiple times? What is the reason the past surveys need re-evaluation?
I can answer from my standpoint, and then somebody else might want to answer beyond that. Our survey field effort was a very rapid survey field effort. We were able to get all 31 cross sections surveyed in a 2 to 3 day period. And in that 2 to 3 day period, we wanted to have enough detailed understanding of where the bankful calls were, where change in vegetation, change in deposition, change in scour was in that reach, that the existing data sets that were surveyed down there just didn't look at the stream function from the same way that we were looking at it. So we considered a pretty minimal cost to go down and get additional cross sections when we knew that we'd have to go down and look at where bankful calls were anyways. From my standpoint, the 30 cross sections, I would have spent 3/4 of the time just going to those 30 cross sections and trying to understand where the bankful stage was, where the deposition and scour was, and the time of taking the cross sections on there doesn't take that long once you're actually at that location. We do auto topo on the cross sections, and we only do 1 or 2 cross sections on each site, so they generally take us on the order of magnitude of 10 minutes a cross section, and that's it. Once we're there, it takes us a lot longer to get to the cross section than it does to survey it.
And so I think what you're saying, Dave, is that you're down there, you're looking for some different things than what the past geomorphic surveys would have been looking for. And that's pretty inherent to the sort of difference in your design approach. So maybe you can spend just a minute elaborating a little bit on the difference in what you're looking for compared to what might have been the design basis for the Army Corps work. supporting their design.
Yeah, the Army Corps of Engineers works off of, and I'd hate to get in the weeds, but hopefully it's helpful to Charles or some other people. Army Corps of Engineers works off of something called an effective discharge. An effective discharge is calculated by looking at a range of predicted uh, flows over a stream location, and you'll synthesize a flow duration curve for each section of the stream. As that's synthesized, you also have to calculate a sediment loading curve for that. And the sediment loading curves is kind of voodoo science, if you will, and it's what I've had a lot of my research in. But we can calculate how much sediment gets moved through a cross section, but how much sediment gets supplied to cross section is very questionable, and that's a lot harder to quantify. So when it comes to looking at a effective discharge, it's related to your sediment supply rate and your water being delivered. And you multiply them together to get the most amount of sediment that's moved over time. So a lot of times that, based on your assumptions of how much sediment supplies in the reach and how quickly it moves through a site, that changes how big your channel needs to be. And that changes the features that you're looking at when you're doing a geomorphic assessment, because you're going to be looking at higher features related to what you think that channel needs to be moving. For the way that we look at it, we start from the smaller features and work our way out. So we look at a feature that is generally not considered in most geomorphic assessments by the Corps of Engineers. A guy named Osterkamp years ago talked about an inner berm feature, which is this regional storm, small storm type feature that grows and supports vegetation that's significantly smaller than the channel form and discharge. But then we have a series of small channels within bigger channels. So we just look at a lot smaller channels to get started than what traditional geomorphic assessment would look at from the Army Corps of Engineers methodology.
Yeah,
and so
that's helpful.
It's
That's
just a
helpful,
different way
Dave.
of looking at it.
Yeah, thanks for going into that a little bit. And I'm cool if you want to move on.
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next portion of your presentation, David.
Okay, so we're going to talk about regional curve application, and we can go to the next slide here. The purpose of a regional curve is really to establish how big a channel needs to be. Once we know how big a channel needs to be, then we can start to say, okay, well, how does that look on plan form? How does that look in profile? How can we incorporate that into the landscape? But until we know kind of that dimension or how big the channel needs to be, it's hard to incorporate. It's like making a pipe network. You can lay out the pipes in your house, but if you don't know if it's going to be a 4-inch pipe or if it's going to be a 1-inch pipe, that's going to change where you can take the pipe through. So let's the next slide. Next slide. This is just a rough idea of what we looked at on each cross section. We looked at the regional curve, the relationship between the bankful channel and the drainage area, and generally we're trying to understand that in the same physiographic region. So we don't want to have a big change in how water gets to a basin, how fast, how flashy it is. We don't want to have a big change in what resists flow in the basin, the type of vegetation, also the type of substrate that resists flow. And we realize that there's a lot of these regional curves that are still developed, and they had been developed over years and years. So we wanted to create a mini regional curve that was really focused just on this watershed and looked at bankful features in this watershed and try to compare that back to data that had already been published through regional curves. So if you look at the picture here, you can see that the big thing that jumps out is that the low flow width of this channel is on the order of magnitude. On the base width of it is about 5 to 10 foot. And the Army Corps of Engineers design had called for a 76-foot wide channel. So as soon as we jumped down into Aliso Creek, what seemed to be obvious from the aerial photography became very obvious as we saw this small low flow channel that was supporting vegetation and different terraces of flows. And you can see in the cross section next to the picture where we have these different breaks and terraces that go up to there. We don't just have one defined channel, we have a series of defined channels inside of there that are nested inside other channels. So if we go to the next, slide, this is the data that we had collected for our mini regional curve. Each one of these points, there's 31 points on here, and there of those 31 points, each point, most points have a low and a high bankful call. So you look at the grade points, and they're the points that we thought were higher than bankful. We look at the lower points; they're the points that were lower than bankful. So it shows you there's a range of variation, and natural streams have a range of variability. It's not like every stream is going to be the exact same dimension. And we also have instabilities. We have some places that have higher sediment supply rates, other places that have lower sediment supply rates, some places that have a lot of vegetation, other places that have been armored and now are at a quasi-equilibrium. So that variability is really important in the design of a channel, but it's also important that we don't design a channel that's just bigger than any of these bankful calls that we're seeing. So we have a tool that we've been using internationally for about 15 years now that looks at a prediction of a curve based on rainfall totals almost independently. So we look at rainfall totals in an area and we say this is where we think a curve could start at. And this allows us to go into second and third world countries and be able to evaluate how big a channel needs to be to do basic water resource work before we actually even have to go to the ground and collect any data where travel is very difficult to get to. So we did the same thing here in California right before we started, and we showed a relationship that when we surveyed, everything was slightly higher than our rainfall prediction, but not that much off of our rainfall prediction. And we did have two distinct different features in a higher terrace and a lower terrace related to bankful calls. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll show how this compared to other published regional curves. And this is just a snapshot of some of the other published regional curves. If I really wanted to take time and look, I could probably find 2 or 3 times this many regional curves that have been published through some sort of documentation in California region. Most of these are peer-reviewed publications opposed to just publication through a permit document or such. So what you'll show here is that the data that we collected seemed to fall in line pretty well with other data that had been collected before. And this was something that we weren't surprised about. We actually kind of thought that it might, but the Army Corps of Engineers channel design was so much larger than any of these regional curves that we wanted to make sure that we had the data from field collected data to verify that it actually should fall close to these curves. And you can see that it doesn't fit all these curves in all the locations. So which curve you choose is always a question as well. And there's justification why you say, well, I choose this curve opposed to this curve. But that justification is never as good as collecting data in the field. So that was the purpose of trying to collect the 31 cross sections, is to create our own mini regional curve and then compare it back. Let's move on to the next slide. And so from the next slide, we're going to be talking about how we can apply this regional curve. So now we have a regional curve that will tell us at any drainage area about how big the bankful cross-sectional area should be of the channel.
David, we're going to take a little pause here just to make sure we don't have any questions, outstanding questions from that last section. Jenna?
Yep, we have a question from Christine Medic. Can we receive the regional curve references used?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd be more than happy to kind of put them into PDF and check the publication and then share and the copyright on each one of them and then distribute them if appropriate. Most of these, if you Google them, you could find them. Some of them you might need a copyright to be able to share them with somebody, but we can look into that and share them. They all are all fairly available for what we've listed on this slide.
Thank you, David. Any others, Jenna? Is that it?
If anyone would like to speak, just as a reminder, you can raise your hand. the Q&A, as soon as these questions are answered, I am making them public. So any questions we've received have been posted in the chat or are in the Q&A, which is still an option. However, you are also free to raise your hand and we will unmute you, and we'd love to hear from someone.
Okay.
Okay, I don't see any.
Don't see anyone? Okay. All right. Then I think we'll, oh, do I see something from Mike?
Yep, let me see here. From Mike Beenan, the data curves rely on recent conditions versus pre-development in the 1960s.
Yeah, that's definitely a true fact, Mike. In the 1960s, we probably would have expected a slightly smaller channel, natural channel to be formed in through this area before you had a lot of development, and now post development and with the changes of flows and what flows have gone to the creek and how stormwater is managed, this recent mini regional curve really is related to the conditions in the creek today, opposed to the conditions of a pristine natural area.
Okay. But your underlying working hypothesis here, Dave, is that there are segments of the creek that are reasonably stable and that you can use those as your guiding reference for how to create and improve stability, improve habitat in other segments of the creek that may not be as stable currently. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. What we look at is we look for reaches that are what we call quasi-equilibrium. So it doesn't mean that they're stable reference quality, but it means that they're stable enough that they are moving the sediment that's coming into the site and not aggrading or degrading. And they may have a little bit higher bank erosion rates than we want, but they're still not aggrading or degrading in bed form. So it doesn't mean stable. We use the term quasi-stable.
Yeah, sure.
Quasi-equilibrium instead.
Geomorphically stable, which is not truly stable. And you don't want it to be truly stable because stable means dead in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
and I think that's an important point.
We definitely don't want a static site. Static site is what Army Corps of Engineers was really providing to the group in their alternative, something that was going to be static, going to be in place, going to limit risk. And our thought is, well, we want something that's going to grow stronger in time and allow a movement of the channel to occur where it's acceptable, opposed to just not allow any movement of the channel to occur.
Right.
We have one more question as a follow-up from Mike. So, quote, natural is based upon altered conditions.
I think
natural can be based on altered conditions at times, sure. What we call natural, we want the natural processes to be able to function within those restoration schemes. So that means that we have to have these altered conditions of flow because that's what's there right now, and we want something that's going to grow stronger with those altered conditions. So that is a true statement, Mike.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the desire. I think this kind of ties back to the desired outcomes that we talked about in the early part of this work group, which is the notion of a functional and resilient ecosystem, as opposed to a pristine and pre-development, pre-European referenced ecosystem. And I think we have, should recognize very much that Dave's approach here is based on trying to create something functional and resilient within the current, or within maybe a slightly improved, but not a pre-European flow regime, which would be really fairly infeasible. So just want to signpost that.
We do have another question from Ray Heimstra. What is the time estimate to complete the work presented today? And I think, Ray, if it's all right, we'll hold that until we get to the end of the presentation where we talk about next steps. Okay, and I think I see one more here. So Mike, as a follow-up, a goal has been to restore the native flows to control pollution at the beach.
I think it's a great goal. I think that the natural channel design alternatives that we're looking at would benefit from that goal as well. So I think native flows are always going to be beneficial for native vegetation, and wherever feasible, that's a great goal to have.
Okay,
Great,
that's all
we
the
should-
questions I see. Thank
Great, thanks, Jenna. We should move on. Go ahead, David, to your next section on priority levels for restoration.
Good. So the priority levels for restoration, we're going to move on to the next slide. And we talk about 4 priority levels. And these are the same priority levels that were discussed with different numbering, but the same priority levels that were discussed by Army Corps of Engineers. The priority level that we use, we've changed the numbering of them a little bit based on a standard reference that was created in 1997 by a researcher named Dave Rosgen, and then republished by Barbara Dahl et al. At North Carolina State University in 2003. The first priority level is reconnecting to an old historic floodplain, so raising up a channel. But the next one is constructing a new channel within the old channel. Third one is excavating kind of benches. It's for stability in places and creating small discontinuous floodplains. And the final one is just armoring a stream bank without creating any new floodplain. So all 4 of these restorations levels are related to restoring an incised channel. An incised channel just means that it's cut down away from the historic floodplain. So they're all related to the floodplain restoration as well as the channel restoration. We can go to the next slide. We have a graphic of what that looks like for a priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 restoration. And this is just from a federal document, so they look kind of silly in the old clip art from Windows 98. But priority 1 restoration is you have a deeply incised old channel, and that's what we see right now on most of the sections of Aliso Creek, is this channel that's cut down pretty far from where the old historic floodplain is. And they'll fill in the old channel with however much material they can find. They can leave ponds and wetlands for where they don't have enough material to fill in. And then they create a small channel that more frequently accesses that high floodplain surface. And that's a real valuable restoration concept that's used on a lot of sites, and we really like doing that on many sites. But it's can be pretty negative when you have a lot of urban development in an area. So this is something where we could think about this on the lower reaches, but we really don't want to think too much about this in the midst of the development on the upstream reaches. A priority 2 restoration is where we take areas that may be natural areas and just lower them to create a floodplain at a lower elevation. So we create this bankful channel, and then we do a series of floodplain benches. This is a real beneficial idea in urban environments where you need to lower flood stage as well, because you can take out trees, you can replant trees, and you're creating more flood conveyance in a system as well. So that's the concept of a priority 2 restoration. Priority 3 restoration is places where you have heavy infrastructure that's going to limit how much of a floodplain you can create at a lower elevation, and you still need to kind of keep the creek at that lower elevation. So you're creating these discontinuous bankful benches or floodplain benches along the channel. And then a priority 4 restoration is probably the restoration that most people think of when they're talking about, hey, we need to stabilize this incised stream. And a lot of times people don't think of it as being an incised stream. They just say we need to stabilize this creek or gully, and they just throw rock on it. And that's what we call a priority 4 restoration. So those are concepts of restoration. I'm just waiting to make sure there's no questions before we move on. So from the Army Corps of Engineers analysis of this, their trapezoidal channel design, they had kind of a 2-stage trapezoidal channel design, and what they were looking at was kind of what we would call a priority 2 restoration in our conclusions. And it's not it's not a bad idea. It's actually good because it gets flood flows moving. But the real question is, how much room do you need for this type of priority 2 restoration, opposed to can you narrow the room so you're not disturbing as much of the ecosystem around the channel. So there's also some other potential alternatives that we looked into on the reach, things like beaver dam analog systems, a stage 0 channel design where we basically don't even create a real defined main channel. We just fill in the old channel. And these are all very useful designs in some places, but they do raise flood stage. So the question is, do we have room to raise the flood stage in the lower reaches, or do we need to keep the flood flows at a lower elevation throughout the whole region? And these are things that as a stakeholder groups, you'll want to discuss, and we'll want to figure out, okay, well, from this, how can we use this channel dimension to come up with a stable design based on a priority 1, 2, 3, 4, or another potential alternative for restoration. So in conclusion, 5SSR and bespoke mitigation, we've done a fair number of channel design on urban channels as well as coastal channels. And with the flashy environment, the potential for changes in flows due to urbanization, as well as changes of flows due to climate change and influences of more flashy hydrology, we strongly believe that a 4-stage urban channel design that kind of emphasizes concepts of a priority 2 restoration is probably going to be one of the best options to start out with from restoration. Doesn't mean it's the only option we do, but it's kind of the primary go-to option, if you will. So let's go to the next slide. And with this,
I don't
we'll
see any questions, but let me
discussion on.
You know, in the interest of time, I think you could probably go to the next and show how this works, Dave, and then we could circle back with any overall
I guess
questions.
It's a good idea. We're going to run short on time. Great.
So we'd go through a multi-criteria here now to put this really quick here. Essentially, all we do is we lay out our goals, we create objectives from the goals, and we look at these different alternatives and say which one of these alternatives meets most of our objectives, and the one that meets most of the objectives is the most optimal. This relies on stakeholder involvement. It can't be done without stakeholders. You can go to the next slide. The stakeholders are the drivers for the prioritization of which type of restoration is done on each reach. So it's really important that people understand goals and objectives to be able to look at ecological uplift. And we would spend a little bit more time, but I want to get to the example concept designs, and we have about 10 minutes left. So do we want to let anybody ask a question if we have one, or just move on to the concept designs?
Why don't we just field all the questions after the concept design presentation, Dave?
So with the concept design, this is kind of what we're looking at for a concept design. We're looking at a 4-stage channel, and this is one of the existing cross sections out there. You can see that we're not really cutting into the high terrace a whole lot. We're doing a little bit of grading on the bank where it's a vertical bank right now, and we're taking a little bit of cut material from the right bank, and we're filling in the channel and raising up the invert, which will give us a little bit better hydrology. So we're slightly raising the channel, but not completely raising the channel. And we're creating a 4-stage channel. We start with a small inner berm channel, which is the light blue. We have the darker blue, which is a bankful channel, which is approximately a 1.1 year recurrence interval. So it happens every year on average. And then we have a flood terrace channel, which will happen closer to a 1.5 to 2 year channel. And then we have a 100-year discharge channel, which is really just graded and evaluated to make sure that we don't have instabilities. And that is all going to, both the flood terrace channel and the 100-year channel are all going to be vegetated based on the existing vegetation that's out there at this time. Whereas the bankful channel will be trying to use native vegetation as well, but we may have to bring in additional species. And then the inner berm channel, in a portion of the inner berm channel, we will have small areas where the channel will be rocked or augmented with the natural substrate with imported material. So what this means is that with this 4-stage channel design, our smallest channel with on the base is about 10 foot. So that means where we place rock would be about halfway through the channel on the riffle features for about a 10 to 12 foot wide swath, opposed to the entire way along the channel for 76 foot wide, as the Corps of Engineers had proposed in their design. So it's a lot less rock that you'll see. Most of this rock that is placed in this smaller channel will have vegetation and sediment that forms over top of it. So as vegetation continues to grow, you would see less of this rock. Because we're not moving a lot of the floodplain, we're kind of working with the floodplain in places, we can harvest and transplant a lot of the vegetation that is riparian vegetation onto the bankful bench as well as the flood terrace bench, and we can transplant upland vegetation to the 100-year discharge. So with this design, even a lot of the vegetation that has to be moved or removed because grading has to be done can be transplanted and reused in a windrow type fashion. So if we go to the next, if you click one more time, this will give you an idea of what the design looked like for the Army Corps of Engineers design. So you can just see that much larger channel. And with the Army Corps of Engineers design, that whole 76 feet or 75 foot would be rocked in their design. And everything where it ties up to the existing ground would have to be excavated. And you could still reuse vegetation for transplants, but when you start having that much cut, the transplants become difficult to manage with just the bulk movement and haul of material. So that's kind of one of the big differences between the designs. Go ahead and hit the arrow button again. So this is kind of what this cross section will look like when we take away the graphic. So that gives you just a really big idea difference. Essentially, the width of your bankful channel in the Army Corps of Engineers design is still bigger than our flood terrace channel, the top of our flood terrace channel. So it's a significant difference. As you saw from the pictures that we shared in this presentation, we only see 5 foot in December of 2019 when we surveyed, we saw about 5 to 10 foot of flowing water. You can imagine over a 76 foot wide channel, you're going to see even less flowing water because it's going to be absorbed through the substrate, and it's going to be a lot harder to define that low flow channel. Let's go to the next.
So I want to signpost something here, just kind of connect this. Many people in this group have been involved in the flow ecology special study and thinking about that. And out of that are coming some recommendations related to the depth and the velocity, the duration of flow, and focused for some focal species a lot on the smaller flows, the spring recession, the summer base flow. And so and I see a comment from Mike also, a couple related to low flows and summer base flows. So is it fair to say this interberm channel could be adapted to provide that sort of habitat if there were specific recommendations that came from SQURP and company related to target species here, and it becomes a little more adaptable to defining what we want that low flow channel to look like?
Yeah, that's correct. Right now, the low flow channel that we proposed is essentially just the low flow channel that was geomorphically noticeable and observed in the field. So we looked at about 40% of the bankful cross-sectional area, and that's what we saw by surveying cross-sections in the field. If the low flow regime changes, we have built low flow channels that had anywhere from about 20 to 70% of the bankful cross-sectional area incorporated into the interberm channel. So we don't have a big concern of changing that. We may have to change a width to depth ratio or how wide that low flow is, and then change the bankful width to depth ratio or how wide the bankful channel is to accommodate those changes in low flow, but that's very feasible.
I think in that way, this design could be substantially more compatible from a concept level with the flow ecology study recommendations than what the Corps' design would have been. I'll let you move on now, Dave. Thank you.
All right, let's go to the next slide. The next slide talks about there are 4 stages, and we have the interberm stage, the bankful stage, a flood terrace stage, which is very common in urban environments, and then our 100-year discharge. It provides more aquatic habitat than what just one big trapezoidal channel would do, and it reconnects the channel to floodplains that have been departed from. So there's a series of floodplains that Aliso Creek has been departed from based on changes in urbanization and just time. So this connects to some of those floodplains. It does not connect to the highest elevation floodplains. It could, if that's the goals and objectives of the group down the road and stakeholders. But right now, our thought is that we still want that flood protection, and it provides riparian and wetland habitat improvements by raising up the stage and also creating these flat benches that we see the benching and the terracing, but to create a flat bench is always beneficial from an agricultural standpoint because it allows water to be captured on the back side of the benches, and then you can have vegetation or crops that grow out from there. So essentially, it's the same concept of terraced agriculture, just doing it inside of a channel. And then we see this migration of vegetation that will grow from that. Next slide. So vegetation area disturbance, our big idea is we want to limit the area of disturbance. There is a lot of areas that are unstable on Aliso Creek and causing high sediment supply rates and instability and concerns, but there's also areas that aren't doing too bad. Every stream's gonna work towards stability in time. If you do nothing to it, every stream's gonna eventually get to stability until there's another big disturbance that occurs. So right now, Aliso Creek is on a trajectory towards stability. The only question is, do we want to wait until it achieves that? And while it moves towards there, is it going to be a lower elevation? Is it going to be not achieving the goals that the stakeholders have by the time it finally gets to stability? And so that's really what we think about when it comes to natural channel design and restoration. We also want to think about the removal of invasive species that are important with the revegetation, but then the transplants are going to be really key for this project and this natural channel design. And this leapfrog approach or this windrow type approach, if we're grading a channel and removing some floodplain material, for us to remove that and then take that transplant material and just put it right back in place at a lower elevation within the reach of a hydraulic excavator is a very feasible process that we do on many projects. It means that the people moving the transplants have to be knowledgeable or have to be directed to be able to move the right species, so we're not moving invasive species. We've had some places where we've trained our contractors and our equipment operators. We've had other places where we've had riparian biologists just be on site and constantly direct the equipment operators. And both those work well. I prefer to have a riparian biologist, if possible, on site, just because they're going to have a lot better idea of the variations in species than you could train an equipment operator. Next slide.
I'm going to do a time check-in real quick. So we're at 10:20, which was the time we allocated for this, but I think we've got more to show, and I think the attendees have some good questions. So I think if we're okay with that, we're just going to continue with what we had. We'll see what we get to at the end. We have a couple questions from that last section, so I think maybe we should get those addressed before we move into this concept, unless the rest of the group feels otherwise. Jenna, do you want to hit those two questions quickly, and then we can
Sure.
do the concept?
Okay, so Mike Beenan, how will the plan comport with low flow requirements for the Aliso Estuary Restoration Project funded by the City of Laguna Beach and the California Coastal Conservancy?
And my answer to that will be simple. I think it could, but I'm not familiar enough with what those requirements are, so I'm going to have to punt that to somebody else.
I think you've already answered this to some extent, Dave, in the sense that you have a lot of flexibility to design a channel that is resilient and compatible with different flow regime. You know, so if the existing flow is 4 CFS round number, and you know that there is a long-term effort to get that down to something lower, that a design could, could tolerate that kind of low flow, flow reduction, from an overall watershed standpoint. I think in a lot of respects you've already answered that.
Okay. All right, we have a question, I think, from Christine.
Yep, from Christine Medek. For the proposed design, can you clarify where you would import rock from, i.e. local, natural river rock as opposed to riprap?
I don't know enough about the goals and objectives of the group to know if it would be a natural river rock or if it would be a riprap. Uh, my my general desire for this type of project is that we harvest uh, what we can locally, and then we augment it with whatever source and of material is going to meet the right gradation. So, what that means that the armoring would have natural rock look to it, even though the bones of it may be a riprap or natural river rock. I I preferably like the look of river rock, but I don't always like the environmental impact of river rock in areas. So we like to source river rock knowing that it's a beneficial sourcing opposed to a sourcing that degrades something else. So that's something that the stakeholder groups would probably have to look at in more detail, the rock to come from.
Appreciate
Okay,
it. Go
we've
ahead.
got two more, Darren.
Okay.
From Rachel Waite, both invasive and non-invasive / non-native species will be removed.
So the invasive species right now is our plan to have them removed, and the non-native species that are not invasive, uh, I don't I don't know what the stakeholders group would what the stakeholders would prefer for that, if they would be removed or not. And then, of course, native species would be transplanted as much as possible. Um, and that's, but that the non-native, non-invasive species, uh, the question from the stakeholders group would be, is that something that is desired to be removed or not? And I don't know how to answer that one.
Jen, I would just add quickly, just a reminder to all, I mean, this is at best a concept plan. And a lot of this, you're going to see in next steps, we're going to, evolve and as part of what we would advocate. And a lot of these questions may relate to later stages of the design and particularly with the input of the stakeholders. So I just remind folks on that.
Thank you, George. It's a good reminder.
Okay, and then we've got one more question from Mike Beenan. Have sewer pipes been identified along Aliso Creek, and will they be compromised, requiring expensive relocation or armoring with new designs? I'm going to chime in real quick first here. I know that SOQA is starting a project now that I believe is intended to be complete near the end of this year to address some of the historic issues with the pipeline running along Aliso Creek. So that's certainly something that will be considered in the design.
Okay, I just want to remind everybody that we are recording this and we will post this online. So if we go past, if you have a hard stop at 10:30, know that you will be able to catch up on the end of the meeting. Go ahead, David. I think we should move on.
So we're going to talk about concept designs, and we just have two rough concept designs to lay out for you. And this concept design, how we lay them out, is really saying this is the dimension of the channel. This is how we could restore the channel based on priority 1 through 4 restoration. And this is what the alignment of the channel could look like after the restoration. So our first concept design was on Reach 5C. And this lays out the channel. We have green line, which is our flood line, our flood terrace. We have the existing channel, which is in orange here. And then we end up having a limits of disturbance. And really what we laid out these concept designs for more than anything else is to get you an idea of what the channel may look like in plan form and what the amount of area disturbance would be to be able to have this type of restoration. It's not saying that this is exactly how it would look. We're not that far along yet. This is just something like a 5 to 10% idea of, hey, this is where we may start to look at for restoration, and give people an idea of where we could be going. Let's look at Reach 10 concept design next, and we'll talk about what that looks like on the next slide here. So the next slide on Reach 10 here, it talks about the restoration, and with Reach 10, we have a lot of infrastructure. So what we're showing here in the next slide, we look at the profile, which is essentially the elevation of the stream relative to the elevation of areas around the stream. So what we show in profile is the proposed alignment of our stream compared to the existing elevation of the channel and the floodplain that the new alignment goes through. So what we're showing in this concept design profile from LiDAR, we're showing a location where up near station 0+10 or 500 feet from the start of Reach 10, we're not really coming off of grade too much. We're about the same elevation of the existing channel. We maybe add in some bend pools into the reach, and then down below where we get to Aliso Creek Road, so at Pacific Park Drive, we're about the same elevation. At Aliso Creek Road, we're at the same elevation. But then in between there, we'll be grading floodplain and reconfiguring the floodplain as well as reconfiguring the channel. So it will allow us to have stability and also flood conveyance. And one of the things that we're looking at in Reach number 10, if we go to the next slide, is we look at the concept of what it looks like for in Reach 10 right now. We have this large grade control structure that's out there. So looking at what it means to be able to take out some of the existing grade control structures and work towards restoration. So on the next slide, what this looks like, and you can go to slide number 38. So what it will look like in our design is this 4-stage channel. Sorry, go back to slide 37. I wanted to go to the end of that one. I told you to move too soon. There you go. So you have this 4-stage channel, which is what we laid out in the longitudinal profile, which the thaw wag, or the deepest part of this channel, as designed, is below the top of the invert of the structure. And we could still keep components of this structure in place, but then we would have a graded floodplain both upstream and downstream. So on the downstream side of the structure, there'd be a slight fill, and on the upstream side of the structure would be a slight cut-in, and we could have revegetation that could occur on the floodplain on both sides of it. So we could still keep a structure in place to give us a floodplain sill, but it wouldn't be a noticeable structure anymore. So we would have components of it, and we'd have to cut away kind of a key, if you will, into this structure that could accommodate a 4-stage channel. So let's go on to slide 38. We zoomed into just the removal of this this dam or this grade control structure, and with the next phases of design, we're looking at something like a 5 to 10% design right now to say that something could be feasible. It's out there. A lot of it's going to be dependent on exactly where the utilities are located related to the structure, what type of utilities are underneath the structure, if there are utilities underneath the structure that would be impacted by any kind of restoration. We have multiple profiles that we could design. We could say complete removal of the entire structure and essentially hit the grade at the bottom of the dam and just tie in to that elevation. We could say partial removal where we're filling below the dam as we showed before, or we could say leave the whole dam in place and try to stabilize as much as possible, but then have to drop down the flows beyond the dam for a different level of stability. So I think part of how we deal with utilities is related to whether we leave this infrastructure in place or if we have partial removal. And where we have partial removal, if we're filling downstream and we have utilities that are compromised downstream, then as long as we're filling, we're not going to have any more compromise to those utilities. But if we're cutting upstream on those utilities, then we're going to have to make sure that the profile is such that's not going to expose these utilities, or it's valuable enough to change the location of the utilities if that is the case. But this is all stuff that there's a lot more design that goes into these, each one of these reaches later, and they have to be driven by the goals and objectives of the stakeholders, opposed to just my opinion of the goals and objectives of the stakeholders. Let's go on to slide number 39. So what we look at in concept design is, and we've provided this as a KMZ file so it can be easily given to people for review and evaluation and questions. They can just look at it in Google Earth, which is a free software for anybody to load. But what we're looking at is this idea of potential restoration. This is a priority 2 restoration. Do stormwater outfalls, the big blue circle on the left side of the screen is basically where there's a stormwater outfall, and we could incorporate best management practices into that. We didn't go to the feasibility of, hey, could we do a best management practice here? And what would the design flow rates would be? Would people want to see it? We just literally said at 5% to 10%, is there space for something that we could incorporate and get some value? So that doesn't mean that we'd want to retrofit anything. It doesn't mean that we'd want to put in that BMP. It just means is there space? And then we also included a couple idea of what some of the grade control structures and outside bank protection would look like from some of the streams that we've worked on in different regions. The pictures that you see on the far right side of this reach are from Colorado, North Carolina, Wyoming. So that's rough ideas of concepts. So let's open it up to some questions here before we move on, if that's okay.
Yeah, perfect, David. Jenna, do you have any questions to bring forward?
Yes, we have a question from Jennifer Blackhall. How soon will the recording be available and where will it be posted? We will work to get that posted today, and it will be posted on our website. I will put the link in the chat. However, it is southocirwm.org/regional. I believe it is. So but I will include it in the chat for everyone to go there. We will also we can also send an email out to the whole all the participants in the group today and let them know where it is on the website so that anyone can view it there. Darren, I think you were going to chime in. We're at time, and we have I think we've had some good discussion. I want to make sure that we get the opportunity to talk about this in full. So would it be wise if, Dave and George, would it be possible potentially for you to maybe join us at the beginning of the next meeting?
Yeah, that would work for me.
By all means, Jenna, you give us the date. We're more than happy.
I think that'd be great that gives some people more time to digest what they saw today with some more questions and not be rushed through that.
So then maybe Darren, we should go to kind of the meeting closeout, and then we can revisit this at the beginning of the next one.
Sounds great. Let's go to, I think we got 2 slides.
Jenna, did we want to come back to Ray's question, or should we table Ray's question for the next meeting as we get into?
Thanks, Aaron.
Let me just go back real quick here.
It's about time frame and next steps, and I think
I think
it might be
we'll
worth
have
it.
to. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think we could definitely come back to that because there's plenty to talk about in next steps, I think, as we, think about taking this concept that's been presented and what would be the, just the mechanics of when do we do more survey, when do we do more design, at what point do you figure out your grade control spacing and
Right.
mitigation needs. And so there's a lot to talk about there. And I think it'd be great to hear Dave's perspective on that, but I don't want to rush him through that.
Absolutely.
But,
Yeah, if that's okay with you, Ray, we will cover that at the next meeting because I think that's I agree. I think it's most pertinent with that part of the presentation. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Darren.
Yeah, so the next slide was a conclusion slide that David was going to present. That just kind of summarized everything. Maybe put that up. Next slide. There you go. I don't know if there's anything real quick you wanted to say, David, or we could address this at the next meeting. I think this is a good summary
Yeah.
of your efforts.
I'll emphasize it just for half a minute here.
Okay.
The mini regional curve really showed us that there's a bank full channel and an inner berm channel that is significantly smaller than the 2-year calculated discharge by the Army Corps of Engineers, and will have a significant smaller area of disturbance. It will have less ecological disturbance, and it will allow for the reuse of a lot of the native vegetation on the stream. It also has a high potential for wetland restoration and revegetation, and there's a high potential for the reduction of sediment load in downstream. And that's important because sediment loading has an impairment in the stream, but also sediment loading does sometimes have benefits to downstream for beach nourishment as well. So those are things that stakeholders should be thinking about as we continue on, if this is a direction where people want.
Would only add very quickly, as you can see, one of the things that I say, the functional and resilient ecosystem is a very broad term. And you can begin to see, and the questions kind of relate to this, is if we're focused on sediment relative to stability and or for MS4 permitting as an example, you may have a different approach than if you were looking at sediment for beach replenishment. And so the goals, it comes back to my initial statement, which is sometimes the goals can be in conflict relative to what the design is going to be. And I think it's so important that this group dialed down a little bit on that issue. The other thing, we threw out the wetland restoration and revegetation question because we know there's mitigation needs. And so the question that we have is there a bunch of really quantified metric scenarios that could come out of this project, depending again on those goals. The other point we didn't really hit on is this notion of phasing, and the idea that you can phase these projects, and we're happy to go through that in the call in the next meeting. But I think it's important that people understand you don't have to do this all at once. There's ways to integrate and approach these projects.
Great. Thank you, George. Let's go to the next slide.
I think we need to go back to the other PowerPoint.
Yes.
Thank you.
There you go. So we had a series of feedback questions that we were going to prompt with and discuss, but since we don't have time to do that, I was going to suggest that perhaps we get these out to those that attended, or I think it's probably best to those that attended. You can take a look at them, revisit them, maybe formulate some other questions, get some answers, and then we can address these at the next meeting. I don't think we have time to get into any of these at this point, but they are important before we move forward that we have this discussion. So that's my suggestion. Hopefully the group feels that that's a good approach. Any feedback from anybody if that's how they'd like to approach?
I don't see any comments. So I think that's what we'll do. We'll send this out with the meeting write-up.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to have to wrap things up. It's already 10:41. I apologize, but I think it was a good conversation. It was a great presentation. Thank you, David. Thank you, George. And I think there's going to be actually a lot more to talk about at the next meeting. So we'll reformulate the agenda for that meeting, making sure that we have plenty of time for this discussion. And I also think that this type of discussion will help us move forward with future projects, because you can see the kind of detail and information and interest from the other members of the collaborative and the kinds of questions that you should and probably can get addressed by other members of the group. So thank you very much for attending, and we will see you at the next meeting, which I believe is, I can't remember the actual date, June, I want to say 25th or 26th, but I could be wrong on that.
24th.
24th, I was completely wrong, one day off. So June 24th. So look for information to be coming to you on that next meeting. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.